Hello and welcome to Meet the Media. I'm Eusebius McKasier. Flushed with Olympic glory, I'm going to bring us back to earth a little and ask today, how do we report on sport in South Africa? Is the media guilty of ignoring the bigger issues in favor of some of the feel-good headlines? And that's what we'll discuss a little bit later in the program. But as always, of course, we start off with the Sunday papers. And joining me this morning to go through them is Stephen Grootes, EWN Senior Political Reporter. Stephen, thank you so much for coming into the studio.
Good morning, Eusebius.
Of course, the one story that is not on the front pages because of time, and it's just the industry we're in, is Castor winning gold.
Well, you know, this is 20th century technology, the newspaper business. And, I mean, you see this problem all the time. Now, you might say that, well, the sports story doesn't really matter. I mean, Castor Semenya, of course, matters for all sorts of other reasons. But you see it with US presidential elections all the time. You see it, you saw, I mean, the best case was the assassination, targeted killing, call it what you will, of Osama bin Laden. You know, the papers just don't get it. But that's what happens.
That's just what happens, absolutely. Well, let's see what exactly is on the front pages of the Sunday Times this morning. We have a fascinating story, Tycoon's Madiba funeral splurge, and an expose there, a really good piece of investigative journalism, the money trail in relation to a really, really nasty story involving potential corruption and abuse of funds around the memorial service of Madiba.
It's amazing that this is the story that keeps on going. You would think that the death of Nelson Mandela would be the one thing within the ANC and across society that would be completely corruption-free. Everyone would manage this carefully. We have this story in Mpumalanga, and it goes through, I think, if I've understood it correctly, the Mpumalanga government, and of course there'll be denials and more investigations. But, I mean, we had it in Buffalo City, in East London. I can't think of a bigger scandal than misusing government money around Nelson Mandela's memory.
Shocking.
And yet there's no consequence.
That's true. Now, Stephen, this is a media show, so I want to know from you, why is it, or is this just perception, that in radio, you guys, us in radio, tend to take our cue from the print media? This is a juicy, investigative piece of journalism. Well done to the Sunday Times investigative team. Why is it that print media tends to break investigative journalism more than we do in broadcasting?
I think it goes down to basically your unique selling point. So what radio does particularly well, better even, if I may say, than television, is that what radio does really well is live coverage.
Yes.
So I've seen pieces this week around the coalition negotiations as they've been happening, where a whole piece has been written in a publication that is completely taken from live radio interviews. If you're Herman Mashaba or Julius Malema or Musi Maimane or James Self, who I think is probably the person who needs the most sleep, all of these people are very busy. The only interviews they're going to do, because they're quick and easy, are radio.
Absolutely.
So they're not going to have time to speak to a newspaper person. So the newspapers will then follow that, and that's where radio particularly does coverage really well.
That makes sense, yeah. So you've got immediacy. They have a gestation period in the weeklies. The City Press today has focused on something that's been bubbling under a little bit, which of course is fees. And you can see their hashtag fees must fall back on the front pages. Find the money. This is an interesting one. The ANC can ill afford, looking ahead to 2019, to alienate young voters, young people. This question around fees and sustainability of higher education sector, Stephen, that is a massive political issue.
You know, the new line there that they have that I haven't seen anywhere else is the idea of President Jacob Zuma saying to Treasury and saying to Bladen Zamande, so Pravin Gordon, Bladen Zamande and Jacob Zuma in a room. There's a bigger political story there. But he's saying fees cannot increase. Now, of course, the Treasury's already said and went public with this, which I think was an interesting decision, to say that we can't actually sustain universities. The money has to come from somewhere. We know how the university vice-chancellors feel. You have to wonder what long-term aim would it serve for President Jacob Zuma to defund our universities in this way. Inflation's over 6%, has been for some time. Universities can't continue to produce excellence and crucially, Eusebius, to produce South African excellence, South African knowledge. Absolutely. It almost stifles that right at the beginning. What is served by doing that?
That's right.
And that's a much longer-term story that I think we need to dig into.
True, and short-termism will get us nowhere. You can have zero fee increase next year, but what happens in the future? The Sunday Independent has an interesting one. 1 million rand lawsuit, Casserols versus MK boss, and this is one that you and I were chuckling about a little bit earlier. And this, of course, why we have you here. You have institutional memory around the details here. Just talk us through what you made of the Sunday Indie.
So this boils down to really a conversation where Kebi Mapatso, the Deputy Minister of Defence, the head of the Umkhonto weSizwe Military Veterans Association, he said that Ronnie Casserols was counter-revolutionary. Really?
Really?
And it all goes back to Kwezi, who's the person who accused President Jacob Zuma of rape. And it goes back to sort of what Mapaswe is saying. And Mapaswe, at any opportunity, defends President Jacob Zuma. That, to my mind, is the motivation here. I mean, he goes as far, really, as defending the Gupta family, which I think is pretty far. And he is accusing casuals of having a hand in that. He was intelligence minister at the time. There's always been this claim that somehow Thabo Mbeki, the president at the time, instigated that prosecution or had influence over it. I don't believe that, by the way. And I mean, I reported extensively on that case. I'm struck by the curious choice of lead here, and I don't want to criticize another media
do go ahead in 10 seconds.
You've got a lot going on, a lot of political news. This is a fight between two people that don't really have huge political power. Why lead with that? I'm sure there's a reason, but I'm very interested in that reason.
Very good question, Stephen. We'll have you back a little bit later in the program. But of course, after the break, we're going to ask, how do we report on sport in South Africa? Are sports journalists guilty of underplaying the big issues? Remember, you can take part right now by using the hashtag #MeetTheMedia. We'll be back right after this.
First few metres, gets up alongside Wambui.
I guess we'll have Steve out for now. Steve will bring you back in segment 3. Where's Marcel? Yeah. Hello, Firdose. Can you still hear me, I hope?
Yes, I can. All good. All good.
Good weather for cricket, I hope?
Unfortunately, no cricket before 12 o'clock. We've got a very wet outfield. Yeah, I mean, the sun's shining, but we've got big mud patches on the outfield. So we're just sitting and sort of watching.
Welcome back. And of course, who is not talking about the Olympics, especially after the gold medal that has been brought home by Caster Semenya? But in this segment, we ask some of the wider questions about sport. What is the quality of sports journalism in South Africa? How well do we, in fact, cover it? And I'm joined, and I hope that we won't have any gremlins. We are joined via Skype in Durban from Firdose Munda, who is ESPN Cricket Info South Africa correspondent. A wet outfield there, so she's got time to chat to us. And also to Marcel Gordon, who's a freelance sports journalist. Marcel, thank you so much for coming into the studio.
Thanks for having us.
Guys, first and foremost, I mean, absolutely amazing that you actually managed to stay awake to watch live the gold.
I think from my side, makeup is our friend. The last 2 weeks have been rather difficult. I've just been doing it for fun, but spare a thought for the journalists who've been covering the Olympics here from home. They're walking zombies at the moment.
For those, were you watching that incredible race this morning? I fell asleep in front of my couch. I watched it this morning.
No, I'm not a nighttime person. Unfortunately, I wasn't. Even though there wasn't much cricket yesterday, I was lights out. So I didn't see it, but I did hear about it this morning.
I want to first talk about the issue of gender. When it comes to Caster, it has been incredible how her body has been trolled the world over. What have you made of the way in which the international media in particular, and I must say locally we've been better, Marcel, I think, have come to her body as a woman and really just anthropologized her in the worst possible way, Marcel?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think first off, we just have to absolutely commend this young woman for how she's managed to carry herself over the last 6-7 years. I don't think any of us at 18 years old would have been able to handle the kind of pressure that this young lady was put under, and how she's carried herself since then has been absolutely amazing. So she's a champion not just on the track and field platform, but also just as a young South African. I do agree with you. I do think South African media took a breath, I think, after this story exploded on the in the media world, and really started delving into what we're really dealing with here. And what exploded, you could almost set your clock to it 24 hours before Caster Semenya ran her first heat, especially the Western media. Started releasing these stories that really weren't based on any new developments in her story. Right. The Court of Arbitration on Sport made their decision and made their finding a year ago already. But of course, in our clickbait culture that we live in, it was decided, let's move from the Court of Arbitration to the Court of Public Opinion. Absolutely. And that's really what has raged for the last week. And some of it has been rather awful and frankly disgusting.
And of course, for those, a lot of that has been couched in terms that pretend to be fair and interesting. I mean, suddenly people will ask questions around competitive advantage, but you can write a piece of sports journalism pretending to care about competitive advantage, but lurking beneath are all sorts of stereotypes and prejudices.
Absolutely. I think that's actually one of the most interesting things that's come out of it. I mean, my company is, the office that I work for is based in India, and they've recently launched an Olympic site. So it's been really interesting to see their perspective on things. And one of the things the editors pointed out to me was that when an athlete from a country comes under fire from foreign media, the media in their own country will tend to rally around them. Of course, India have had a similar case of this kind of gender question. And I think it's become very much a first world versus, I don't want to say third world, developing world, shall we say, issue. And we've got very set notions of femininity, don't we? We expect women to look a certain way. And if they don't look like that, then we don't understand it or we don't want to understand it. So it's been very easy to slip into stereotypes. I see it I cover mostly male sports. So I see it in cricket, in football, in rugby all the time. And I think it's starting to change. I've definitely noticed things changing in the last few years.
Let's talk a little bit, because there were also lots of prejudices that came up with Wade van Niekerk. I mean, how stunning was that absolute performance? I mean, I've seen that, I can't remember how many times I've now seen the footage of him breaking the world record and just being so incredibly humble. But one of the interesting things, of course, Marcel, is identity politics suddenly reared its head. And you had this battle on Twitter almost between black excellence and coloured excellence and what easy. What did you make of how race surfaced around the reporting on his victory?
Well, Eusebius, how much time do we have? Because this conversation could just rage on. And I must admit, I'd gotten up in the middle of the night to watch this race. And when I left social media, it was all go, Wade van Niekerk, our boy, our guy out there. And I woke up a few hours later and people were at each other's throats. And they were saying, no, he's not coloured, he belongs to South Africa. And certain people who identify strictly as coloured were saying, let us have our moment. And for me, what was almost baffling was the fact that we come from a history where identity was pushed on people as part of a construct to divide and rule. And yet here, 20-odd years later, we still have people on social media, which is the platform that we now live and breathe on, unfortunately, telling people, no, you can't say he's coloured and belongs to you. You cannot tell people how they can or cannot identify. I think we both agree on the point that many of us identify as black from a political point of view and identify as coloured from a heritage and cultural point of view. There's nothing wrong with that, and there's nobody out there that can tell you otherwise.
I want to ask you about that. For those, I mean, AKA tweeted, if someone can be proudly Zulu, why can't they be proudly coloured? Did you find it jarring how this debate unfolded around political identity, or do you think it's just really South African reality?
I do think it's just South African reality, and I think that sport is becoming increasingly obsessed, if I can use the word, with identity, because we've had a lot of push, and a rightful push, might I add, from the Ministry of Sport, saying that it's time to change and we've got to take change seriously. And for too long, South African sport has got away with not changing and just with remaining elitist. And now that change is being forced, you're getting a lot of identity politics. I mean, we get it in team sport all the time. The Springboks played yesterday, so did the Proteas. And there's a lot of emphasis on the so-called quota players, the so-called targets. So I think it's becoming very challenging to determine are we changing correctly? And are we picking the right people for the right reasons? And it's really quite a raging debate. I find it very difficult to explain it even to an international audience, which is who I write for, because they don't always understand the nuances and the history and how important it is that we seek representativity as much as we seek winning.
Which brings me, Marcel, to the crux of the beat that I wanted to ask you about, the sporting beat. Is there enough space given to sports journalists to be able to tease out these identity and other issues? Because we get the data, we get the results on the back page, and often it seems to me as if sports journalists like yourselves, like Firdose, you walk around with so much insight about the wider socio-political context within which sport happens, but we never see that kind of texture, and then we're almost surprised when something comes up on Twitter.
Well, a very simple answer to your question is no. Journalists are not given the space. They're not given the time. They're just not given, I think sometimes they're not given the pat on the back to say, you can go and write a feature and delve and take your time to do it and that kind of thing. But it's an issue that all newsrooms, I think, struggle with. And what speaks to those issues also the juniorization of newsrooms. People that are hired in a sports department who do not have an interest or an understanding of sport. You wouldn't hire a journalist to work in a business on a business desk and they don't have an understanding or even a passion for business, would you? But why is it that we're sometimes finding in sports departments that is indeed the case? And then you can go to gender as well and those kinds of prejudices as well. But no, sports journalism in South Africa, I think, they're not given the time of day, as it were, whether in space or time to do what they can to delve into real storytelling that just happens to be sports related.
Those you nodding there, I want to bring you back in because I know this is close to your heart, particularly in cricket. But I mean, even if we take someone like, say, Luvo and his drug addiction and the way that story played out, it is very clear that beneath the glory, there's a human being with a full biography, but how much space do you get in the industry to be able to tell us those stories and bring the full humanity of that person to bear in understanding how he came to be the brilliant person that he is?
I'm quite lucky because I work online. So, I mean, the internet is unlimited, isn't it? And I get quite a lot of space. But I can't say the same for a lot of my colleagues, you know. The word counts are strict. And as Marcel was saying, sport just gets sort of dumped somewhere and people tend to see it as kind of the little toy department and don't take it that seriously. So it's very difficult to be able to tell that human story. It's very difficult to get someone who wants to publish it, actually. And it's a real worry. I mean, I've been among journalists for the last few weeks traveling with the cricket, and we've all been talking about how jobs are closing and the first people to go are usually in the sports department or something similar. So it is difficult. I think a lot of independent platforms have started, and obviously there's a huge blogosphere as well that comes with its own problems without checks and balances. But I think eventually we will have to get some kind of independent sporting media going so that we can tell these stories and we can tell them well.
Marcel, it would be very weird not to talk about something that's obvious here from an optics point of view. Two women talking about sport is itself rare. So it's amazing how in the newsroom there are also biases from the outside world that we reproduce. Why is it that the sports beat tend to be dominated by men?
Well, again, how much time do you have?
Discuss 20 seconds.
Well, look, it just comes down to with the way newsrooms looked many decades ago. Just your general reporting pool used to be mainly males before women were, let's say, allowed into newsrooms, allowed into corporate boardrooms, allowed to wear pants, you know, that kind of thing. And unfortunately, sports departments have been, I think, on the dovetail of that whole process. You're seeing newsrooms in the sort of hard news section of the newsrooms, mainly run by females at the moment. And yet in the sports department, you can still count them on one hand. What I think is great, if I think back to when I first started covering some sports in the late 90s, it kind of would have been a little pat on the head. What are you doing here at St. George's Park kind of thing? And now you're seeing more and more women really hustling, putting themselves out there and saying, I'm not just here to do the lifestyle stories. I can actually do a match report. I can do a colour report. So it is changing.
Firdose, thanks so much. I hope that it dries up there so we can actually watch some cricket. Thank you for joining us. I really do appreciate it. And Marcel, you're going to stay on here in the studio. Of course, you can take part by using the hashtag #MeetTheMedia, and we'll be back right after this. And welcome back. You are, of course, still with Meet the Media. Stephen, we talk about how sports journalists often don't get the space to be able to explore the socio-political elements of sport. But the flip side is that when Kester wins, she's going to be front page news. It might have to be the first thing that you have to acknowledge tomorrow on your show, on the Midday Report. How do you take the story forward? Firstly, from the point of view of time will have passed, but also as someone who yourself might be pigeonholed as a political dude. What do you get out of the sports story on your show?
There's no difference between sport and politics. I mean, let's get that out the way. So that's the one thing. It also depends on the issues. Sport is a lot like politics in that everyone is allowed to have an opinion, and most people do. So you've got to bring those kind of wider things in. I mean, people like Andy Capistano in the Mail and Guardian have been writing about the politics of rugby for a generation.
Yes.
And I think the way you do that is you've got to, firstly, you mustn't be scared. You've just got to jump straight in.
Yes.
The second thing is you've got to look at the political issues and draw them out, and that can be the hardest. And often, like when you're putting together a midday report, you want to make sure that everyone gets a voice, and which are the stronger voices, or which are the voices that haven't been heard yet. It's often finding the voices that haven't been heard yet. That's the tricky thing. So it's to take the debate forward is sometimes the hardest part.
Marcel, how does one do that? With my team, when we were preparing for the show, we had to ask ourselves some ethical questions around Kester, for example. We don't know all the medical facts. We've been calling all sorts of things and all sorts of names and labels. And the real question for me is, if you are a journalist wanting to get more meat out of this story, if you want to engender public debate, what would be the 3 or 4 key issues that you would delve into next in terms of the news cycle, as it were?
Well, I think it's approaching it like you would any story, but that, of course, depends on what kind of journalist you are and what kind of training you have, what your foundations are. And when I have dealt and helped and trained and molded young journalists and producers in radio and in television, my point of departure has always been tone. How do you relate to this before you even start your 5 W's and an H and all of those things you get taught when you train as a journalist? What is your tone? What makes this a compelling story? And that immediately gives you your point of departure on how you start a conversation about it, how you write your intro, how you start the interview, and how you ask the questions that will become the basis of your story. So for me, it's about tone. In a story like Caster Semenya, for me, it's a human story before it's a sports story.
Interestingly enough, the tonality went completely pear-shaped around the tick addiction of Luvo. You had some places like a Daily Maverick handling it really, really well, and basically saying this guy had a pact with the devil and then he jumped and managed to get gold, and it was a really beautiful tone. And then you had some of the other reports, Sowetan Live, I'm afraid, really didn't do very well, just saying basically drug addict wins. How do you not shy away from the history of the athlete, but at the same time get the tone right, Stephen?
It's very difficult, and you see this problem in headlines. I'm not at all surprised that Sowetan Live's issue was around the headline, because you want people to read it. Now, you could argue, and sometimes people do, and sometimes they haven't done very well, that a very provocative, controversial
clickbait that Marcel was talking about.
Yeah, but it does bring people into the bigger issue. So if you want to change minds, people have to first read the piece. I don't know if I certainly wouldn't have gone with it like that, but I can understand the temptation to do it, because it's an amazing story. And I mean, I can imagine if, say, he had been an alcoholic, would it have been a less provocative story to say recovering alcoholic? Because people who are alcoholic and have gone through a process often refer to themselves as recovering alcoholic. It reminds you a bit of the victim debate in covering rape stories. Some people say they are a victim, some say they're survivors. And in a way, what you have to do in the end, is you have to go to the person themselves and say, how do you identify yourself? And I think that's the starting point.
In fact, there's that Daily Maverick headline I was talking about. Luvo Manyonga broke a deal with the devil and decided to jump rather than die. I mean, that just immediately gives you the feels in a very good way.
An amazing work
absolutely, from Internet, and we should acknowledge it. So that's really how to get it right. Because in the end, clickbait doesn't help you, because the TMG platforms trended, but for all the wrong reasons. Because
and what
Black
really,
Twitter went after them and fetched that weave.
What really
Which you don't want.
It was the Wade van Niekerk piece, they would have fetched the teeth. If you were pushing stereotypes, because
Yes,
people said they were
exactly.
pushing stereotypes. My point here, however, what I hated about the debate and how it unfolded online, however, is that because of that headline, many people thought it was okay to go after the journalists. And that's a lack of understanding about how that process works. Many times, or most times, journalists, the last time they see their piece is when they email it off to the office. They have no input in what the headline is, and people were being criticized for even including the fact that he has had this amazing turnaround in his life that has brought him to that point. So that witch hunt that now happens for journalists who are basically just doing their jobs, I find a little bit unacceptable.
It's also, how do you tell a story of someone whose life was in danger because of an addiction to someone who wins, who does as well as he has done? How do you do that in 6 words or less? It's very, very tough. And I mean, I always
use his name.
For starters, yeah.
Sure. And I mean, but it is tough, and this is why it's always headlines. I mean, it's Bladen Zamande's immortal quote: "The story is at war with the headline." And I mean, that happens so often because it's a tough thing to do.
Okay, that's where we're going to leave it. Thank you so much. Always love your insights, both of you, and hope we'll have you back on the show soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's, I'm afraid, all that we have time for this week. Thank you so much for engaging the show. You can continue doing so. Remember to use the hashtag #MeetTheMedia. From me and the rest of the team, have a wonderful week ahead.